And if you've been to any of these sessions before, any of these skill set audience development plan sessions by the audience agency, you're actually going to see quite a few slides that you've probably seen before. And that is half on purpose and half because I myself, from more of a digital engagement background, am actually still learning the ropes of proper audience development myself. I've kind of done it by proxy and by accident, doing social media and content on websites. But here I've actually been trying myself to see how to integrate digital into that audience development process. So not trying, one of the main points of this entire talk is you should not have a separate digital audience development plan and a separate on-site audience development plan, because your on-site visitors have a digital presence. Some of your audiences may be wholly digital, some of them may be a blend, but it doesn't make sense to just split them apart and silo it in your organizations. That's also like a get out of jail free card for me, because if it looks like I don't know what I'm talking about, that's probably 75% true. But this is where the conversation can come in and we can talk through some of these issues as we go. But it means that the main outline of today should be about an hour. We'll see how we go. Audience development frameworks, I'm going to talk through some of those, some of the options available to us, how to analyze both yourself as an organization and your audiences, some planning and tactics for audience development, and then how you evaluate and report on all of that. But first, I'd like you to fill out a quick Mentimeter link. So I'm going to also put it in the chat. I can make my life work. But if not, if you go to Minto.com and use that code, it should also work. But I'm also going to put it in the chat. Let's see what you're saying. So this isn't super scientific, if I'm honest. I think if you're interested in the formation of digital teams in organizations, there's still a really good paper written by Katie Price at the V&A in London and Daffod James at National Museums Cardiff about how digital teams and digital work is organized, particularly in museums and galleries, but I think also cultural organizations too, where it essentially goes from the ad hoc and uncoordinated through to some people are doing quite a good digital job, but it's a bit siloed, to those organizations that have the money and the authority to set up whole teams for it. But then that also means that digital work tends to get just concentrated in those teams. So you might have a digital marketing or just marketing team, social media or content team, IT teams, that kind of thing, where they take it all on and the rest of the business is kind of shut out from digital work. Quite a few even that having a digital role or team, but most digital work is left to them, which I'd say a lot of people are. It depends on the size of you. Interesting. Thank you for giving me a bit of an idea of where you're coming from. So I think that means that luckily most of this talk will be relevant to all of you, because it is about integrating that digital into the rest of the organization, not keeping it in its little hole. And usually I also throw in here stats about how many people are using the internet, but essentially we cannot keep that digital work siloed within particular roles or particular teams. We as organizations need to be looking at audiences in their entirety, and in their entirety isn't just them turning up at the front door, coming in and doing things with us. Everyone is also living digital lives, more or less, but it is important to note that some audiences do have digital poverty, can't always connect to the internet, don't always have all of the devices like a desktop computer, might just be using a smartphone. Some audiences don't have good connectivity, but keeping that in mind, still when the stats come through, it is up in the high 90% of people who use the internet daily and are using the internet to be essentially running their lives. It's their admin, it's how they interact with governments and local authorities. It's how they entertain themselves, it's how they find information, it's how they buy things. And we cannot keep considering audiences without appreciating this context of them and how they will live in their lives, and also wider culture and environment. But like I say, I only got an hour. So that's just a point to say we need to consider them in the whole. It's not just digital, it's not just physical, it is a combination. But now I'm going to go through audience development frameworks. It's worth looking quickly at what audience development actually means. And I mean, it is in the title, you are developing an audience, but that almost always means you're inviting people to do something. It's something new, so you can develop that audience. And digital comes into this in several ways. And where people will probably use it most is actually in that invitation. Digital marketing got into the digital game much earlier than the rest of cultural organizations, cultural organizational teams. But in terms of finding people and communicating to them, whether that's through social media, through your e-newsletters, through search engine optimization on your websites and all the rest, it's that invitation of getting the message out and getting them to do something, which is the core of what most people think digital is, which of course it isn't, but it's a big part. It's also people, and as I've said, those people are both online as well as physical. But understanding people and how they use the internet and how they run their lives is something we need to understand in the first place if we're going to invite them in to do something. And then they're doing something. It could be your program could have physical and digital elements. You could class the content you publish online as part of your program. You could be doing wholly digital products like games, online performances that are wholly online, or it could be our usual programs of things happening, performing arts, exhibitions, events, all the rest. But that could be a blend as well, where they're happening on site, but there's some sort of digital life for them. So it's all intertwined. Development doesn't just mean developing one particular audience. You could be thinking of your audiences in terms of deepening engagement with a particular audience. So you're already doing something with them, you just want to make that a deeper relationship. You could be offering them something different, or you could be doing something entirely new. So there are different types of audience development. Some principles that stand behind it, and this ties a lot into digital thinking as well, because it isn't just one thing you do and it's finished. It's an ongoing strategy of change. You're constantly iterating and reacting to your data and changing as audience needs change. You also need a clear flow for your mission and purpose. Otherwise, obviously, it's just completely irrelevant. Say you could be trying to attract young adults who love Stranger Things on Netflix. So you could say, oh, well, we'll just do Stranger Things on Netflix. But if you say a museum of artillery in Dorset, that isn't very relevant to your mission and purpose. It might be relevant to the audience you're trying to develop, but it's not relevant to you. You need to find something that is in the middle of that Venn diagram of your needs and your mission and their needs. Which usually means, as I kind of said from the beginning, it has to be organization-wide. It can't be siloed within one team or one person. It needs everyone working towards the same goal. So it's not a digital goal, it's not a public events goal, it's not a curatorial goal, whatever it might be, it's everyone's goal around the same audiences. Which means working from evidence is critical because it cuts out a lot of that siloed thinking. You need core evidence to work from. But not doing the same thing for all audiences. Every audience has different needs, whether that's in the program, could have a particular program for families, one for older audiences. We're getting into slightly more sophisticated ways of describing audiences later, don't worry. But also how you market to them, what kind of educational needs people have, the environmental needs, all the rest. Which is why it's so critical to involve users in this process too. So you have your evidence, but ideally you're also involving users so you can get it from the horse's mouth, make sure that you're staying relevant to what they need. And back to the first points of it being an ongoing strategy for change, planning to evaluate what you're doing, building that in so that you have time and effort to evaluate, review, and adapt. One thing we use to structure our thinking quite a lot is the Ansoff matrix, which I absolutely love. I'm going to be showing you this 2 or 3 times in this presentation, with this idea that the vertical axis, the y-axis, I want to say, I think I did badly at maths at GCSE, going from existing to new. So the bottom axis, again, I think is the x-axis, your product and program, whether that's an existing product or program or something new. And then these 4 squares, the bottom left even, they're a current audience, it's your current product and program, but you're looking like, how can you give them more of this type of audience, or how can you deepen this engagement with what you're already giving them? So just more like marginal gains around what you're doing. Or you could be, if we go to the top left, developing new audiences, but with the product and program you already have. So you think you have something which might appeal to another audience, you might need to understand their needs a bit better and target it to them better, but you think you can develop them with what you're already doing. And then bottom right is, it's an existing audience, but you think you could actually do something new with them. So a new program or a new product. And then top right is the brand new stuff. New program for new audiences, which requires innovation and new thinking. We're going to see this play out through this audience development process. And like I say, if you've been to these kind of sessions before, you've probably seen a lot of this, but I'll be throwing in where I think digital can really supplement and tie into all of these stages in the audience development process. First, it's worth quickly covering types of research. So we've got primary and we've got secondary. Primary, if you've ever done a degree, it is original research. It's stuff that you've collected specifically to answer your questions and your needs in your research. Secondary is, it might have been collected by someone else for another reason, but it's useful for your purposes. Qualitative is essentially a bit more, this has completely left my mind now. It's a bit more based on what people say and think, and less tied to data or particular measures. Quantitative is, survey, so 1 to 5, it's a bit more quantifiable in terms of data sets. You could either run this internally or you can contract it out depending on how much resource you've got, how much time you've got. Move straight onto the situational analysis. One good place to start is to look at your strengths and weaknesses, but here we have taken a slight tack to the usual SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and instead done something called SWOT, which makes it a bit more strategic, we think. I always usually think that strengths and opportunities cover most of what you need in a SWOT analysis anyway. So here it's got ambition, what you want to achieve, and results, the kind of impact that you want, what you're doing to achieve, whether that's external in the world and societal. When it comes to integrating digital, very often people are a little bit, what's it called? The challenge seems very large. And I think you can either be scared by that challenge or actually quite excited by the opportunities that digital change and transformation can offer your organization. But either way, there's quite a lot of things to sort through and to figure out. And very often people are just jumping from project to project, figuring out things as they go. They know that some areas of their organization aren't as good as they should be, whether it's, say, your website content management system is creaking, and you really think you should have a digital asset management system. You know you should be getting into e-commerce, but there just hasn't been the effort or the will there, or you just need to get a handle on your social media and content and all the rest, whatever it might be. It is worth taking the time to actually sit down and work through those issues. So we often recommend using a tool like the Digital Culture Compass, which is designed and developed by Arts Council England, which lets you, which gives you a framework and a method for analysing each area of your organisation and marking it in terms of its digital maturity, whether it's 0 initial, through to 5, which is transformational. And not everywhere is going to be transformational. Most people score themselves in like the 0 to 2 mark, even like the largest of organizations that I've done this with. But it's designed to be collaborative, so you sit down and talk it through as a team together to figure out where the gaps are, and it lets you ask the right questions and figure out the right answers to them. But it's worth doing because when you come to audience development, you might have ambitions when it comes to digital products or digital content or whatever it might be. But then you realize you don't have the kind of foundations or policies in place to make that work. You don't know where to start. And those foundations or policies, they give you the grounding to actually do this innovative, fun stuff. So it's worth, as well as figuring out broadly what you're doing as an organization, to also get a handle on this digital side of the organization. Understanding the population is key before you even begin to think about which audiences you're going to develop. We'll be getting to specific audiences quite soon, but first, this is about the wider everyone, basically. There are lots of tools to do this. There's the Office of National Statistics data. We have area profile reports on specific areas in the country. Audience spectrum, cultural participation monitor. I'm about to show you all these, so I'm not even going to bother looking down that list. Maps obviously help. If you're a visitor attraction, if you're attracting visitors, you kind of need to know your area and who is coming and what they look like. You may find it useful to segment according to local authority areas, voting wards, postcode sectors, whatever kind of works for you, so you can start breaking this down. And luckily, that's how most organizations who are running kind of analyses and populations divide things. So you can be looking at indices like deprivation in your areas. If part of your mission is to serve deprived and underfunded audiences, this is a way of finding out where they live and how you can reach them. If you are, particularly if you're part of Audience Finder, you can run area profile reports, which can give you demographic data on particular postcodes. So you can start digging into the demographic backgrounds of who is living and engaging with culture in particular areas. You can be looking at social and economic indicators and indexes, depending on what your aims are. If you just want to kind of understand how things stand and where the opportunities are, like here for Salford, this co-op socioeconomic indicator is saying this below, it's about the national average, below the national average, sorry, for housing space and the environment, quite well served for transport, well served for health and these other measures, quite low inequality. So is there any way which our organization can help boost those numbers? Is there a place for us in that, in this, essentially? But in terms of figuring out digital use and benchmarking in the wider population, the Office for National Statistics has incredible reports on things like internet access, social media use, how people are using the internet and why. So the amount of people that are using the internet every day, how that's broken down by demographic and area and socioeconomic background and all the rest. I'm often dipping into the Office for National Statistics data to kind of beat people over the head with, to say, this is how people are behaving. This is how audiences are connecting to and using the internet. So we need to be there to help get them engaged with us. And also be using services like Statista. I use this quite a lot just to see how social networks are performing, but they have tons of demographic data on, again, how people are using the internet, how people are using these social media channels, how this is changing year by year, country by country, region by region. Some of it you have to pay for, but it's all good, just background information for when you're looking at how to use digital. And then when it comes more to the changing behaviors of how people are behaving, almost everyone is publishing some sort of reports, annual report. I'm often using Hootsuite's social trends to see how things are changing year by year, particularly in social media and content. Pull back out to the wider population in terms of their general cultural engagement, particularly during the pandemic and what's changing after the pandemic. I'd recommend using some of the free data from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which we're running as the audience agency. So we've been surveying the public periodically throughout the pandemic and ever since on how they're engaging with culture, both in person, digitally, or participatorily. So doing activities, downloading resources, that kind of thing. But also how that ties into what they're doing in their wider leisure. So whether going to the cinema, reading books, doing things with friends, how that is changing as we're coming out of the pandemic, and their attitudes to coming back as the pandemic kind of finishes. This kind of data, how people expect to engage post-pandemic with heritage, where it's more often or less often, how that's broken down by art. Also here on the left, interesting charts like the impacts on physical visits for those interested in digital activities. So whether a digital activity means they are less or more likely to then go and do that in person. And we've also got data on engagement with digital content from cultural organisations in general throughout the pandemic, which has actually been in free fall, which is interesting. But I think here it's also worth saying you don't look at this data once and you're finished with it. Monitoring and listening are key to tracking to change in behaviours and trends, particularly when it comes to digital behaviour and trends. So you shouldn't just be saying, okay, we've got this report on how audiences behave, we'll never look at this again. You need a mechanism for reviewing this periodically. Actually, I won't be able to go too much into detail on this, but I highly recommend having some sort of governance group who can track emerging business and user needs. And you have this way of assessing options of whether you do some discovery research on them, whether you think they're too much effort and you abandon them. But you have some sort of mechanism for saying this behavior has changed in our users, or there's this need in the business, and we need to do something about it, particularly when it comes to digital behavior and needs. I mean, there's a very simple example. Everyone is always asking their content person or team, why are we not on TikTok? If you have some kind of digital content group whose job it is to say, we can see the social media channel is exploding in popularity, people are asking us this question, it's their job to assess how useful it is for the organization. Is it the right audiences? Have you got the resources? All that kind of thing. So you can actually say, we've looked at it in the right way, we are going with it, we're not going with it, and these are the reasons. But it's just to say, you need something to keep on top of things. When you've got an idea of those audiences, just segment them. If you don't know segmentation, essentially you have a big lump of people, but you need to split them into smaller groups and segments, which all have pretty similar requirements, usually along these lines. So you could segment audiences by their demographics, whether that's their age, ethnicity, where they are in life. There's kind of usual background data, which you can get from population data, you can get from surveying your audiences that come to you, or more widely. You could do it by geography, particularly works well with postcode. But again, can do it for surveys, visitor books, that kind of thing. And for your online audiences, you can do through Google Analytics and social media, which I'll be getting on to. You could do it through behavior though, and this is where you need a bit more sophistication in your segmentation model. And you get the data from things like booking records, people buying tickets, surveys, but then also you probably putting them through a segmentation model like audience spectrum, which I'll explain in a second. And the same kind of approach for attitudes, but that's a little bit more qualitative. So you could be doing focus groups, interviews and that kind of thing, just actually getting people to talk about their values and the reasoning behind what they do and why they do it. When you're doing segmentation, it's a simple checklist for these audiences to make sure they're actually robust enough, that your segment makes enough sense. You need to be sure you know enough about them. It needs to be a big enough sample size. I think we're usually talking above at least 250 people when we ask people to do our surveys, to make sure that's enough people that you can be confident enough if you surveyed, say, above 250 people, that that's representative of your audience as a whole. You also know that you can actually find and communicate with them, so they're a useful segment to know, and they're homogeneous enough. So is your segment actually, do they all have pretty similar characteristics? Everyone will still be different, obviously, but you're looking for enough points of commonalities that you can group them together and it doesn't kind of fall apart. If you're going to do this yourself, I would start by identifying the groups that are actually important to you. So that could just be, say, families, students, whatever it might be for your organization. And then you can start making those segments more sophisticated by layering it up from those approaches we just talked through. So getting more data on their backgrounds, doing surveys, using all that background data about your audience. And it can be quite an iterative process. So you can build this up by beginning with an hypothesis, and you plan to add evidence over time. So for example, you could have a hypothesis that you know that your core visitors come often. They're aged about 60 to 75. They tend to live in or just outside town. A high proportion are home and heritage, which is one of the audience spectrum segments. But we don't know their motivations for visiting us. So you could then be running surveys to find out their motivations. Or you could say schools are critical for actually reaching frontline families, another audience spectrum segment. So you're reaching that family through the children, and you know they currently don't visit. But we don't know how schools in particular plan and find information for school trips. So again, that's probably either a survey, potentially a focus group, and then changing that online journey to fit what you find out from that group. So I mentioned audience spectrum a couple of times. I'll go through this very quickly. It's fairly popular in the UK as a segmentation tool for multiple data sources. I'll explain how that works in a second. But we've essentially segmented the entire UK audience into people who are high engagers with established arts and culture, so these three, medium engagers, which are these three, home heritage, trips and treats, and low engagers, which are slot, kaleidoscope, creativity, heydays, upholstery, Facebook families. This is now actually frontline families. We've changed that because it was weird to call it Facebook families. Give you a bit more detail on what actually means in practice, what these segments actually look like. Upholstery, again, you have to take it with a pinch of salt because obviously everyone is individual in themselves, but broadly, they're quite sociable retirees looking for inexpensive mainstream local leisure opportunities. And we break them down a bit by where they live, their backgrounds, how they engage with arts and culture, how they tend to use digital technology, and how they like to live their lives. You can build that up through images. So over here, we've got trips and treats. They're the kind of people who did Joe Wicks during the pandemic, doing their exercises. They like to get out and about, talk to each other on WhatsApp. They tend to be quite family oriented, doing things like the NHS rainbows during the pandemic. It's just getting that kind of image of them in your mind. And then kind of figuring out where these segments might actually live if you're trying to reach them. So if you're using audience spectrum, audience finder, audience agency, you can see how much of a percentage of a postcode area this segment takes up. So you can see here, experience seekers, they're quite young, outgoing people. They're very centered in urban places like middle of Manchester, around Salford. We've recently made these a little bit more sophisticated because I've realized that some segments contain actually two quite different types of people. So while experience seekers, just take one example, share a lot of core characteristics, there's actually a split between socially minded midlife professionals with varied tastes and adventurous students and graduates in diverse areas. So while they have a lot of the same tastes, they obviously have quite different lived experiences, which you might need to take into account when you're using them as a segment. For each of these segments as well, we do actually have a section on digital engagement. So you can use this information to both direct the type and complexity of technology in your program. Like I said, with the earlier, older group, don't particularly enjoy using technology for everything. So you might try and make sure that there's a phone up alternative, and that the information that you do put on your website is very clear and straightforward, but also quite simple things like choosing which online channels to reach audiences on. If you know your segment isn't on Facebook, then don't use Facebook. If you know they're on Twitter, use Twitter. It comes down to those very simple just prompts of how to use this information. In terms of who actually is currently engaging with you though, so these audiences who are already doing something with you, whether that's in person or online. Again, there's a lot of different tools how to figure that out. I've talked a lot about Audience Finder. Just very quickly, how we come up with the segments is we take ticketing data, so people who buy tickets when they put in their information. Audience Finder survey data, so that's doing surveys in person, and digital audience survey data, so doing surveys online. We kind of put that into a big mix. We filter it through Audience Spectrum, those 10 different types of audiences, and then we use that in these products, so you kind of know where that comes from. And what that looks like in practice, in ticketing, the information we gather where people buy tickets and it's connected to our channel, our platforms. You can look at where people are spending their money, party size, crossover between different offers, that kind of thing. Show stats, so if you have an entire show, which segments that show was most popular among, who were first-time bookers, that kind of thing. And in surveys, a bit more detailed information on how they rate you, their motivation for visiting, their demographic background. You can also ask about their digital engagement. So whether they found you through social media, Google, those kind of channels, whether they use those channels themselves, and how they engage with you in particular. In terms of understanding your digital audiences though, and this is where it's interesting to kind of compare your online audiences who are engaging with you on your website and social media with the audiences that you're getting in person, buying tickets, doing that kind of thing. One key area to look at in Google Analytics is your acquisition. And I'm using Google Analytics for screenshots for all of these. But have they found you through Google search? Are they finding you through social media or email? This will give you a bit of an idea of A, how effective you are on social media or email or your other marketing channels. But also, if you know you're getting a lot of people finding you through Google, you can dig into how people are searching for you and what kind of terms they're using. And then you could then start making more of those kind of offers that people are searching for. If everyone is coming to your website because they've been searching for ancient Egypt for year 3 classes, that might be a good pointer to say there's an audience there we can develop by creating more of that kind of content. Same kind of reasoning goes into how people are engaging with your pages. So Google Analytics 4 has a new, semi-new measure called page engagement, which is essentially how long someone is engaging with a particular page. So you could be looking at that to see which pages are most popular and least popular, to give you again an idea of what audiences are actually interested in and how you can reflect and deepen that experience. Also events on Google Analytics 4, but also in the older version of Google Analytics, but now they're making them a bit more standard, so you don't have to do too much yourself. So you can be adding in events for when people are downloading resources, scrolling down pages. You can also be putting in proper events like when people are buying things on your website, signing up to newsletters, finding a particular page, whatever is a useful action for you to know. You can be tracking those, and again, if people are doing a particular event more often and that's more popular, then that's another indication that that is something that you should be doing more of or making it easier to do. Equally, if there's something you think is very important but isn't very popular, then it's an indication that you need to work on your website content and make that a bit better. And in terms of understanding actually who your audiences are, going into your demographics and seeing where they are from around the world, which cities they're coming from, what kind of language they're using, just to kind of benchmark who was coming to you and trying to dig into a little bit about why they're coming to you. Are they all quite local? Is it national? What pages are they visiting? Again, how can you gear what you're doing to what people are using you for? A little bit on tech. So what are people using to access your website? And usually people focus on whether people are using desktop or mobile. So you can make sure that your website is mobile ready rather than designed purely for desktop and make that a better experience. For all this, it's worth asking the right questions. And Google Analytics gives you a lot of data. You should be asking things like who's using the website, how is that relating to physical visitors? Is there a big difference between who's engaging online versus on site? Are users engaging with the pages you actually want them to? And how can you improve those pages? If they're not engaging with the ones you want them to, but if they are engaging with others, how do you make them even better? How are users finding the website? And does that mean you need to improve your search engine optimization, your social campaigns, whatever it might be? And you could be looking at individual statistics like a user's exiting pages too quickly. They land on a page and just leave straight away. Are there ways to improve the user journey so they don't just leave? They actually find what they came for. Will you hook them in with something they're interested in? You can get much the same information through social media about your audiences. For Facebook and Instagram, I've actually started just recommending that people use Meta Business Suite, but this requires that you have an Instagram business profile and you've linked that to your Facebook business page. But it's finally a simple way of just seeing who your audiences are, both on your Facebook page and Instagram, how old they are, where they come from, and what content is popular and least popular. Highly recommend it. Similar analytics pages for pretty much all social media. There's one, Twitter analytics. It's free to anyone with a Twitter account. They've stopped showing you demographic information about your followers though, because they realized it was all basically fake. They made it up based on what you were tweeting about and who you followed, and they realized that wasn't a very accurate way of describing who you were. But you can still look at how your tweets are performing and analyze your content that way, at least. You could make things easier by actually signing up to something like Hootsuite, and then you'll have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, whatever channels you're on, at least all in one place, so you can compare demographics, compare performance, and save yourself a bit of time. A little point about comparisons and benchmarking. We talked a lot about data, and it's worth saying that any statistic that appears interesting or surprising, so you might find out something you didn't expect, it's always worth double checking your findings and the interpretation. Just because you have data doesn't mean that it's particularly good, basically. And this goes particularly for social media and digital data. Like when you're gathering all this information from Google Analytics or your social media channels, you should take it with a pinch of salt, because very often it's an approximation. Speaking as someone who uses social media, who enjoys things I see and I never actually like any post, you're kind of relying on what you can see. You're always looking at the effects of people's actions. But if people don't take an action, it doesn't count. Someone might enjoy your page, but they just don't like it. You don't get to know that. You only get to know what people actually click. That's me, basically. And also sometimes Facebook algorithms lie. Like if you've ever been involved in social media, you probably found out that Facebook has just completely lied about how a post has performed over the past couple of weeks. It does just happen. So particularly when it comes to social media and web data, it's worth taking the general trends, but you should always be caveating and questioning that data and using insights from that data, and essentially not be tyrannized by your data. So you're making educated guesses half the time with this sort of stuff, but it is still mostly grounded in reality. You just kind of need to know that it exists. Also, when it comes to this, don't compare yourself to other organizations with more resources. So you may be seeing people doing similar things that you're doing and doing really well, and you're not doing so well. And you might be saying, well, because we haven't got 1 million likes, we must be failing. I would say focus on what is realistic for you as an organization. Don't assume that success for you means getting as much engagement as, say, the British Museum. It's all about percentage increases for yourself. And this is where it's good to bring in multiple perspectives. It's why it's good to have not just your survey and ticketing data and whatever data you can get from surveys and focus groups and all the rest, but also bring in your website and social media data and other digital data sources so that you can kind of compare and contrast and see how things match up. I've got an example of that for you coming up. So I can get past that. We're on to like identifying opportunities. So you've looked at your audiences, you've looked at the wider population. You may have identified segments that you might want to develop as audiences, but you've still got to identify the opportunity within those segments. Where can you put the resource where it matters? We often recommend using this pyramid principle. So you have a situation, it could be we have so many thousand visitors, or percentage of these visitors are from this particular group. There's a complication in that. And your mission is to serve the whole community, but there may not be enough percentage of your visitors from that particular group. So you're underserving the community, and you're also not making enough money, that kind of thing. So your question to yourself based on that situation and complication might be, how do we better reach this group, or how do we increase total visitors by whatever percentage? And the answer might be then, well, we need to actually, this group isn't coming in, so we need to go to them. We could be live streaming events because we know that they tend to engage more online. They don't live locally. And we'll target them with paid ads, so we know that they'll see it. Because they're not following us, they don't know we exist. We need to actually put ourselves in front of them with paid ads. But also we know that they enjoy influencers and listen to influencers. Why don't we invest in e-commerce and partner with artists from this group Z that these people enjoy? I have this other example. Group Z, I don't actually mean Generation Z, but you could pretend it's them. This idea that only same sort of situation where only a percentage of your visitors are from this group, but you know that the group, this audience segment doesn't live locally, but they're very active online, and supporting this group is actually core to your mission. So they might not live locally, but supporting and engaging with this group is very important to you as an organization. So you both need to know how you can reach them, but also how you can create purely online experiences that you know they'll find valuable. I think in this kind of case, you'd be saying, well, we need to know more about actually their needs. They're not a current audience, so we can't ask them. So we might need to commission or set up focus groups to understand how they behave online, which might lead to something like co-running Instagram live sessions with key influencers and who are part of that group on a particular topic. But just as a bit of an example of how you start from, here are the facts we know, here's a complication, what questions can we ask about this, and how do we answer them? And so third, how do we combine all these things, compare them with each other, and come up with something useful? This is an example from an organization I'm working with at the moment, which I've scripted out. Yes, I have. Perfect. So it's data from different sources. Here on the left of each of these bars, well, first we have all of these audience segments from Audience Spectrum along the bottom. The left-hand bar in grey is the percentage of that city who are part of that audience segment. So this organization is within the city. And then we have three different surveys. We have a visitor survey, so a physical visitor survey from 2019, a public program survey, so people came to do events or workshops in 2019, and then a digital survey in 2022. So comparing each of these data sources and seeing whether they're out of whack or whether some a misrepresentative, you can see they're broadly in the same ballpark, which means you can be a bit more confident in that it's actually a true representation of your audience. But here you can see things like experience seekers are 38% of the audience in this city, but in terms of their surveys, they're only getting about 20-ish% coming to the museum or engaging online. So that might be an opportunity for this organization. And then using that Ansoff matrix I showed right at the beginning, putting some of these audiences onto that matrix and kind of deciding, yes, we have these audiences in yellow who we are currently existing and servicing quite well. And then we have these new audiences we need to break into in green. And where do we think we have an offer that we think we can give to this new audience, or where do we need to do something entirely new? Is there an audience, say schools, where we think we actually need to deepen that relationship? So we already have an offer, but we think we can make it even better. Or where do we just have marginal gains, which is like retirees? They already like what we do. It's just improving the experience. Just as an example of how you can kick off this kind of thinking. This doesn't include people you don't know. You've looked at the wider population, you've looked at the people who are engaging with you, but there's also people you don't know. We often recommend using personas. And the idea here is you're working with your colleagues to create a believable flesh and blood person who's kind of representative of your target audience. And you're trying to, you essentially set them up so that when you're creating a program, when you're coming up with ideas, you can test it against this persona and say, well, will Dave like this, or will Anita like this? And if it doesn't match their needs, how they live their lives, how they engage with arts and culture, then you might need to change your program or your idea. But it also really exposes the gaps of what you don't know about an audience. You might find yourself slipping into just making things up. And that's telling you, we probably should go out and do a focus group or a survey to find out more about this audience. A couple of tools, well, actually there's one tool in here that I really like to use, is this empathy map canvas as well. So it's putting yourself in the shoes of this person. What does their day-to-day life look like? Whose opinions do they value? What are they doing in their jobs and in their evenings, in their social lives and their weekends? And what are the pain points in their lives? What are their fears, frustrations, and anxieties? And what are their gain points? What are their wants, needs, hopes, and dreams? And all of this helps you figure out, how do you make their pain points better, and how do you make their gain points even better? It's just good tests to make sure that you're being user-centered. Another good way of figuring out what people are thinking is user testing, particularly when it comes to digital products and content. So this is, say you've got an idea for a piece of content or something on your website or products, but you have to make sure it actually works and that people can do what you want them to do. So user testing is setting people a task. And this can be as easy as saying, can you find this event on our website? And then sitting them in front of Google and letting them try and asking them to speak out loud their process. And as they're navigating through your website and coming across obstacles or things that work well, you're making notes of these things so you can fix them afterwards. But a very useful tool to use. At a broader level, you could be looking at journey mapping. So this is looking at both the objectives of your users and the organizational objectives. So a user objective might be that I just want to go see something interesting on my lunch break at this local museum. Your organizational objectives might be that they learn something by seeing from the shop. And you're looking at all of the touch points along that journey. So A, how do they know about you in the first place? What do they do when they're in the building? How do they know there's a shop available? Are they searching for you online before they go? Going on Google Maps, those kind of things. And how do you make sure each of those points in that journey push them to doing the thing that you and they want to do? As examples, we did a project with National Gallery looking at the most common journeys of their audiences. So here we've got people starting from Google with a personal interest in art and the National Gallery, Each of these coloured lines is a different audience segment. And you can see some people tend to go in the what's on route, so they actually want to go and visit and book a ticket. Other people just want to browse paintings. And you can see here, this is where some of their content is really popular. Must-see paintings, picture of the month. And as these circles reduce, you can see fewer and fewer people are making it to the end, where it might be something like watching a video, sharing. At each of these stages, that is analysing what else can we do to make this an easier journey? How can we make this simpler and more engaging? There's another good one from the Smithsonian where they may have gone slightly overboard, but they're looking at the entire user journey of considering a trip through to going back home, and where each of these decisions are made, and whether it's word of mouth, marketing, how they find out how to plan their journey, what they do when they're actually in the museums and galleries and halls, and what they tend to do afterwards. And again, going into each of these areas and thinking, how can we make this even better? What do we need to do on our website and social media, but also what do we need to do on site? And how do we make sure that everything is balanced and representative of the journey? You could also just get people around a table and do a workshop and have conversations and structure it in person, which feels a bit mad to say after 2 years of the pandemic, but you'd be surprised what you can get by just sitting people down and getting them to think through a problem. 25 past, so I'm going to go quickly through planning. I'm going to skip this simply because of time, but I was going to ask you at what stage you tend to consider digital in your projects and planning. The idea that most people probably say too late, and it's just saying don't do it too late in a nutshell. But it's also about setting audience development objectives from the beginning. So you've probably all heard of SMART objectives. Each way you can actually measure something, whether that's percentage changes, approximate goals, whether people actually achieve an activity or do something. And you can differentiate them by audience type, so different objectives for different audiences. You can test whether they're actually plausible, so you could be looking at competitors and seeing how they perform, whether that's online or on site, and seeing whether it's a realistic target. But you should be open to iterating as well. So if your SMART targets end up being completely unrealistic, you should be able to change them without feeling bad, as long as they're still useful and causing you to change how you're working. And you've got to expect progress to be gradual. So don't think you're going to get to dizzy heights within a year. It's all a long game. And the same goes for digital metrics. So I'm often telling people to set benchmarks rather than unrealistic targets. So, you say have an average engagement per month or an average amount of users on your website. Track that and then see how you deviate according to that benchmark month by month, and then review it annually, because you're trying to see what pushes you above that benchmark and how to stop being pushed below it. It's all about improvement rather than just killing yourself. And also using digital metrics to measure success of an objective, rather than you're saying we want 5,000 Facebook likes because we want it, but instead your Facebook likes is measuring your growth of a particular audience. So it's not saying you're doing digital for its own sake, but because you want this wider organizational impact. In terms of putting that into practice, the actual action bit, and where even though this says we're only halfway, this gets a lot more swifter from this point on. The evidence is really the hard bit. The strategies and the planning is where it comes down to your own creativity and imagination. So I've already talked about the Ansoff matrix. This is where, once you've figured out the audiences and where they sit in these boxes, it's where you can now start thinking, how do we make an offer that works for them? So here in the bottom left, audience penetration. It might be doing a bit more consultation. It might be getting your existing audiences to advocacy for you, whether that's in person or social media. Audience development, it's probably more about how you're marketing and pitching to people. So it could be really finding out where these new communities live, which channels they're on, what kind of messages and content they like, and creating that according to what they like. Bottom right, and offer developments, these new activities. But for an existing audience, again, it's probably a bit of research to figure out what they're interested in, what's trending at the moment, finding these new opportunities and building them up. Diversification, which is new audiences and new products. It might be trying to work in much more in partnership, commissioning people to do what you can't do, creating new digital work to reach new audiences, that kind of thing. You could also be going back to SWOT, so looking at your strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats, and figuring out where the opportunities lie in all of this. So you're trying to here use your strengths to take advantage of opportunities, trying to minimize your weaknesses, you're using your strengths to overcome threats, and you're minimizing the effects of weaknesses to avoid threats. So the example of that the opportunity might be that you're part of a local CPP program to do with children and young people, and that ties in with one of your strengths where you have a free low-cost family program. So you could be engaging and promoting to families involved in other partnership programs like the CPP. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to whiz through the last of those. You look at each of the areas and how you can turn weaknesses into strengths and overcome your threats with your strengths. 7 Ps is just a good way of organizing what you're doing: product, price, place, promotion. You can see this in the slides afterwards, but I'm just going to whiz through it so that we can have some time for Q&A. But when you're looking at your program and what that involves, this is a really useful way of breaking that down into a bit more detail. How much does it cost? Where's it going to take place? How are you going to market it, and to who? Who's involved? Who you're partnering with? What's the user journey in the activity? Those kind of things. And you can then segment that according to those Ansoff matrix splits. We're doing more of something, deepening that engagement, broader, deeper. You can be monitoring your progress through things like data and dashboards. Dashboards, I find, are always a bit of a pain in the bum to set up. I've always found logic models and theories of change really useful. So turning some of those hypotheses to into long-term outcomes. We want to develop this audience because we've identified that's a gap. We have the strength, so we want to make more of it. And then working backwards to see how you address that outcome. Here's just an example. We need to send offers so that we get a certain percentage to redeem offers and attenders. But that to be broken down into, we need to identify lapsed bookers, we need to contact them and come up with an offer. We then need to evaluate the success of that approach and just try these different approaches and see how it works. A lot of this comes back to what I call, you'll often see this called the marketing funnel, the engagement funnel. And this is going back to the thing I said at the very beginning, that everything should be integrated. You should be thinking from the beginning, but that isn't to say that you may not have a digital activity or bit of your program, which is what this connect thing in this funnel means. That's where someone is doing the engagement with you and doing the thing that you want them to, which could just be coming along to a workshop. Even though that in itself isn't digital, you've still got to make people aware that the offer exists. You've got to make them interested in it. You've got to make them consider doing that thing. And then ideally you're nurturing a relationship with them so they come back and do it again, or join a newsletter, become a member, whatever it might be. So even though that particular thing may not be digital, you might be spreading awareness through your digital marketing. You might be making people interested by having clear information about the workshop on your website. And when they're considering how to do that thing, how to come to that workshop, your user journey then needs to be super clear of how they get to do that. So they need to know, there needs to be a clear, say, book now button. It needs to give you all the information you need to come and attend and have a good time. And all of that requires collaboration between all of your teams. It needs that public engagement team who's running that workshop to have that information ready, to know how to prepare it in a way that works well for your website and how to turn it into social media, or they know how to work with people who are doing social media and the website to make that all work. You should also be thinking, whenever you're doing something in your public program, everything is an opportunity for content. Say you're doing an exhibition on Edgar Allan Poe. You have an exhibition, you have all of the content in there. You should be mining it rather than making up new stuff all of the time. It could be turned into Twitter threads, could be a website quiz, could be a weekly Facebook post, could be an article, could then itself turn into an Instagram story. All of this will depend on who the audience and aims are for that exhibition or that original thing, and how you're trying to get that out to the world. You could not do a Twitter thread, you could not do a website quiz, you could focus purely on Facebook because the audience you're trying to reach is there. But you've got to know that from the evidence from these first phases that we talked about to make those kind of decisions. You also don't really know some of these things until you've tried. So particularly when it comes to digital, even though your program may have quite physical one-off events, with digital, the beauty and the pain of it is that you can do new things very quickly and see how they work and then make tweaks to them and try in a slightly different way. So you need to get into this mindset of, you have a hypothesis that, say, an audience will like a certain thing. Based on all that evidence gathering that you've done, you create a piece of content, say, to appeal to them, you publish it, you see how it works, and then you evaluate its success and then change how you do it the next time. But you're constantly evaluating and iterating. Same goes for product development. Say you're creating something a bit more intense, like an e-commerce platform. If you're identifying some of those opportunities in your program, you need to be aware that you shouldn't just jump in. There's that same sort of process of defining the opportunity, scoping the cost, testing it, and launching it, which could be a 5-hour presentation in itself, but I'm just flagging it. And that will all help you when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, which is where we are now. Evaluation framework. This goes back a bit to the theory of change model a little bit, but the idea that you have your outcomes, what are you trying to do overall, what are you trying to achieve, what are you actually doing in terms of outputs that achieve that outcome, and how are you measuring the success of that outcome, and a bit of methodology on how you're going to find out the indicator of that success. In terms of audiences you're evaluating, you don't need to evaluate everyone, but you do need to know which segments of your audience you're evaluating, how you're counting some of your data. So whether you're counting individual visits, which could be some visitors coming more than once, or if you're just counting visitors. Same thing kind of goes for websites. Are you counting users, sessions, which is a whole session where you could be visiting multiple pages, or are you counting every single page that people visit? You just need to kind of know which bits you're focusing on and why. And the same thing goes for digital metrics. Because they're great for figuring out who your users are and how they're interacting with you. They're kind of terrible for determining motivation and satisfaction. Digital metrics are great for figuring out what people have done when they're taking an action, what they've done on your website, how they've interacted with you on social media, but it's very hard to get in their heads and say, why have you done that? You can make educated guesses, but you'll never really know. So when it comes to digital metrics, if you want to know more of that detail, you need to fall back on surveys, focus groups, and that user testing I talked about earlier to kind of dig deeper into why people are doing things with you digitally. You also need to tell your story. It's no good just having loads of graphs and data because that will turn people off. You need to be telling the story of what you're trying to achieve, what happened, put some real people into it, some real feedback from users and visitors, and make it clear that this is a learning journey and what you're going to do based on all of this data and how it fits into this wider audience development that you're trying to achieve. In terms of digital reporting, as an example, I find it's really useful to do a very friendly top level visualization of your data, whether that's things like social followers or website visits, where you're really telling the story based on that data. You're saying, we got more followers this month because of this type of content, and we did this type of content because we were trying to reach this audience in this way, and it paid off. So next month we're going to do this. It's having those hypotheses, that constant curiosity, and you're iterating every single month based on your new data. And questions you could be asking yourself, because you really only want to focus on what's relevant and useful, and telling some of those stories. It could be something like your workshop was sold out, but is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? If it was sold out, could you have live streamed it for people who didn't make it? You could have 25,000 followers on Facebook, but does that actually make you better than an organization with 15,000? How many of those followers are actually engaging with you? How many people are making it say to your website based on your posts? Are those followers working for you, or are they just there? Or you could be saying, well, 73% of our website visits are from new users, but is that evidence of actually reaching new demographics? Are these new users coming back to the website? And if not, then why aren't they? Which pages are they visiting? Which ones are they exiting from? How do they come to the website in the first place? How do we know more about who they are and what they're doing? Or you could be saying this article that you've visited by 23% more people than average. But again, did any of those visitors then return to the website? Did you manage to sign any of them up to newsletters? Was that a call to action on that page? What can you learn from how this article performed and apply it to the rest of your strategy so you can keep having that kind of success? Or you've got audiences who are leaving positive comments on your Instagram posts, but you've got to understand what's the context. Are you publishing posts that get very positive comments, but they're actually irrelevant to the mission of your organization? So you're just chasing the engagement for no purpose? Or how can you harness that positivity in these comments and turn them into useful actions like getting onto your website, buying something, that sort of thing? You could also be just asking people directly. So I'd highly recommend even just polling on small questions, whether that's through Twitter, Instagram, or on site. Or you could, like I said earlier, be doing more of those creative sessions once you've finished these kind of projects, gotten to the end of, say, a particular audience development 1-year plan, going back to some of these audiences and saying, what did you think of all these things that we did? What can we do next that's better? So, and this is me done, 10 minutes late. I'm trying to think the main points of integrating digital into audience development. I think one of the main points is really that understanding the whole picture of your audience, which includes digital. People aren't just digital and on-site, they are both. They're living their lives online and in the real world, as we all are. It sounds really simple to say, but we often don't just consider how people are using the internet in their lives. You really do need the whole organization in planning audience development. Everyone has something to contribute, and it usually impacts on every part of your organization anyway. You should be tying the digital and the public program together. A large part of that is understanding what is possible and what is unrealistic, and you do that by assessing your own digital maturity. If you're not quite sure where to start, this is the place to start, to just get an idea of where you are now and where you want to be, and how that can then tie into your audience development. And when it comes to the user journey, how people find you, how people do the things that you want them to do, and how they do what they want to do, don't focus on it being purely digital or purely physical journeys. It's very often both. They might be finding out about something online or through word of mouth. They could be having a friend tell them about particular events, which they then Google, which needs a good web page, which requires people working well behind the scenes. And then that live event needs to turn into content afterwards to engage more people in coming to the next one, which is where it comes back to this iteration and experimentation all of the time. But that, I'm sure, thankfully for you, is actually what I'm going to call it. And we do have some questions, which I think popped up. Adam Former, you asked me to share a link. Which link was that referring to? You're still here. Working on the sunshine.
That, I believe, was the link that was the person from Wales and from the Royal Academy talking about digital teams.
Oh yeah, I'll link it now. Well, I find that. So as I said, thank you. Thanks, Anna. And yeah, like I say, I think it might be slightly clear that this is still something that I'm thinking through. Obviously, I think audience development changes depending on the organization you are, like how intense you go, how intense your segments are. A lot of it comes back more to the approach. It requires people working together. It requires having your data and evidence sorted, basically. And then it's how you run things. We're getting people united behind, we're trying to reach this audience. And we're going to brainstorm this kind of offer. And some of that may be physical events which have a digital dimension to them, whether that's what they're live streamed or they have some sort of result that turns into content, or you have things on the side like Instagram live interviews, Q&As, that kind of thing. But the idea is you're not doing it for its own sake. You're only doing those digital parts of the development because you know it makes sense for that audience. And you're doing it on the channels that you know they're on. And it kind of removes a lot of that doubt around why the hell are we doing this and what are we doing it for? We're just doing social media for the hell of it. Not that that's what the only thing digital is, but it's a big part of it. And very often I find people doing social media are just kind of like doing what they like. And I could say that because I am one of them. And that's definitely not true of all of them. Let me rephrase this. They're not doing what they like because very often social media people are very in tune with who their audiences are and what they like and what kind of conversations to have. But very often it's in isolation from perhaps more traditional audience engagement teams who are running workshops and working with schools and doing all those kind of things. And there does need to be more joined upness there, I guess. But now I'm just waffling. Any other questions? Find that link for the how different teams are organized digitally, and we'll send that out with the rest of the resources. But otherwise, if there are no other questions, thank you for, last question. Recommendations for small organizations who have a very diverse program. For example, for one strand of work, we're doing free activities for local families. For another, we're making quite challenging performance work for a very engaged audience. Sometimes these things feel at odds. I've been there in the past where suddenly you're talking about one thing and kind of doing almost a 180 to a different topic, and it's a bit jarring. I think that honestly comes back to using different channels in the right ways. So obviously, you might have a quite diverse following on potentially your social media. So you obviously don't just have one type of audience on your social media, but it could be that when you're doing free events for families, that's just more of a natural fit for Facebook groups. And doing catching, if you know that you've got more families and parents following you on Facebook, you keep that almost just to there. But then if you have quite challenging performance work and you know that people tend to enjoy that debate and to have that interesting challenge on Twitter or Instagram, you do just keep it to that. So that you'll see a lot of people just posting everything on every single channel. Whereas I think actually you need to know this channel is better for this channel is better for that. And actually we should be targeting these. We know these families that follow us on Facebook won't care about this very challenging work. They might do, to be fair, but there's something a bit more relevant. But it is, again, playing it a bit by ear. Like, you might be surprised what people like. You might be posting something on Facebook which, based on all your evidence, you'd never expect them to engage with. but actually they love it. And that's happened to me in the past, which is why I was saying take a lot of that data with a pinch of salt. And these segments are like, they are accurate to an extent, but you can never fully capture individuals and all of our different worries and interests and everything that makes us human. This is getting quite deep, just about talking about audience segmentation, but it's almost like back to that Orwell's rules of writing. Ignore all of these rules if you end up doing something beastly, I think he says. And that's where that experimentation comes in. It's always worth just trying something out to see if it will work. But yeah, so I hope I've answered that, the main bit of that question before just going off on a tangent. I think otherwise that is it. In which case, yeah, thank you all for coming on. I mean, if you're down south, this is a very steamy day, but I'm interested in developing this and how we do this and how we integrate digital into audience development. So if anyone ever wants to chat and talk things like this through, I'm very open to it. But otherwise, thank you everyone and have a lovely rest of the week.